Jackson Grant was staring at the datapad in his hands, trying to make sense of the message it displayed. It had arrived from the Galactic High Command, and the title alone was enough to raise a brow. "You've been assigned to me. Human, time to fulfill your romantic duties," she smirked. At first he thought it was some kind of prank, a joke from a fellow diplomat or one of the more mischievous members of the Galactic Council. But the message had been sent from the office of Princess Kira of Arendor, a name Jackson recognized all too well. She was a prominent figure in the galaxy, known for her intelligence, her royal beauty, and her ruthlessness in dealing with political matters. It wasn't the kind of message Jackson could ignore. After a few moments of hesitation, he tapped the screen to read more. The message didn't give much else away. It simply listed the coordinates to the planet Arendor and mentioned that he should prepare for immediate departure. Jackson was puzzled. What did this mean? A romantic assignment? The idea seemed ridiculous. He had heard rumors about the princess's icy demeanor, her unyielding control over her kingdom, and the way she dealt with the outside world. She wasn't known for kindness or compassion, let alone anything that could resemble romance still. Orders were orders. His superiors hadn't given him any more details, just that this mission was important for the future of humanity's relationship with the Arendorians. With a sigh, he packed his bags and prepared to board the next transport ship heading toward Arendor. He'd been a diplomat for over 5 years now, but he had never faced anything quite like this. The journey to Arendor was quick, thanks to the advanced warp drives of the Empire's fleet. Upon arriving, Jackson was greeted by an alien landscape that seemed too beautiful to be real. Towering spires of silver and white reached high into the sky, and the air was filled with the soft hum of floating cities. The capital was a mix of elegance and power, a place that felt as though it had been designed to leave an impression on anyone who entered. Jackson stood on the tarmac of the Royal Palace's landing bay, feeling slightly out of place. He was just one human in a galaxy full of intelligent species, but this assignment was different. The message had said, romantic duties, and the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. Was he supposed to be her partner? A companion in some sort of diplomatic event? He had no idea. His thoughts were interrupted when a group of royal guards approached him. They wore shimmering armor, and their eyes were hidden behind reflective visors. Without a word, they gestured for him to follow. Jackson didn't argue. He'd learned over the years that it was best to go along with the flow when you were in someone else's territory. They led him through the opulent halls of the palace, where the walls shimmered with crystals that seemed to glow with an inner light. The halls were decorated with alien art, some of it abstract, some of it depicting long-forgotten battles between rival factions. It was also beautiful and foreign, but it also made Jackson feel small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. After what felt like an eternity, the guards stopped in front of a large set of doors. One of them stepped forward and knocked. A voice from the other side called, "Enter!" The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Jackson stepped into the room. There, sitting at a large desk adorned with strange glowing devices, was Princess Kira. She looked every bit as regal as the rumors had suggested. Her skin was a pale lavender, her eyes a sharp, piercing silver. She wore a dress made of some kind of shimmering fabric that seemed to shift colors as she moved. Her hair, long and dark, cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall of ink. Everything about her was otherworldly, captivating, but it wasn't just her appearance that left Jackson speechless. It was her presence. Even seated, she exuded an air of control and authority that made it clear she was someone who commanded respect and demanded it from others. "Ah, the human diplomat," she said, her voice smooth, almost musical. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" Jackson nodded, still processing the situation. He had been prepared for many things in his line of work, but this was something else. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, as though she were trying to gauge every thought, every emotion running through his head. He straightened himself, trying to appear confident. "Yes, Your Highness. The journey was fine. I received your message." "About the romantic duties?" A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. A smile that held no warmth but seemed to promise something more, something he couldn't quite place. "Of course." "You're confused," Kira said, rising from her seat. "I suppose no one explained this to you, did they? How typical of the Empire's bureaucrats. No matter." She waved a hand dismissively as though she had little patience for the details. You're here now and that's what matters. Jackson frowned. I don't understand. I've been assigned to you? For what exactly? What are these duties? She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. There was a teasing glint in her eyes now, one that made Jackson feel both intrigued and uneasy. You've been assigned to me, human. For your company, she said, her voice taking on a playful tone. Your duties will be simple enough. Accompany me to various events, represent your species, and keep me entertained. Her smile widened slightly, but there was something calculating in the way she said it. But don't get the wrong idea. This is not a partnership. It's a diplomatic formality. Jackson blinked, still unsure how to process her words. Keep her entertained? Was that all? It sounded absurd. But there was something about her, something that made him hesitant to question her further. He had heard stories about Kira, how she ruled with an iron fist, how no one ever dared to cross her, not even her closest allies. I'm not a performer, Your Highness, Jackson said carefully. I'm a diplomat. Kira chuckled softly, the sound rich and full of amusement. Oh, don't worry. I'll make sure you're well compensated for your time. And if you prove yourself, well, we'll see where that takes us. She turned back toward her desk, sitting down again, but this time her demeanor had shifted. The playful teasing was gone, replaced by a serious, almost contemplative expression. There are those in the Empire who would prefer a different kind of alliance, she continued, her tone now businesslike. But I find humans to be more interesting than most other species. Your adaptability, your unpredictability, it makes you valuable. Jackson couldn't help but feel a little flattered, but also wary. What did she mean by valuable? What was she really after? Before he could ask, Kira glanced up at him once more, her smirk returning. Don't get any ideas, she said, as though reading his thoughts. This is strictly professional. For now. Jackson nodded, though inside his mind was racing. He had no idea what kind of game she was playing. But whatever it was, he knew he had just stepped into something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Jackson had no idea what he was walking into when he agreed to the assignment. Princess Kira's words lingered in his mind. Company, entertainment, and that teasing smile of hers. Yet when he awoke the next morning in the guest chambers of the royal palace, he felt more confused than ever. His role here wasn't clear. Was he really just her companion, or was there something more to this mission? The question gnawed at him as he prepared for his first day under the princess's watch. The palace, as impressive as it had been the day before, was even more overwhelming in daylight. The walls shimmered with a faint glow, and the floating platforms above seemed to hum with life. Jackson felt small, just one human in a world full of beings who were more advanced, more powerful, and in many cases far older than him. Still, the sense of unease wasn't just about the palace. It was about Kira herself. He had heard whispers of the princess's cold demeanor. Ruling a kingdom as powerful as Arendor was no small feat, and Kira wasn't the type to trust anyone easily. People feared her, respected her, and most likely stayed far from her whenever possible. Yet here he was, pulled into her world. When he entered the grand dining hall for breakfast, he was surprised to see Kira sitting alone at the far end of the long table. There was no entourage of royal guards around her, no servants rushing to attend to her every need. She looked like any other person, except for the way she carried herself, the regal posture, the air of command. There was no denying her beauty, but it was her presence, her power. That made her seem untouchable. You're late, Kira remarked as he approached the table, her silver eyes scanning him with that familiar, unreadable gaze. Her voice was cool, but there was a slight tilt to her lips that made Jackson wonder if she was actually amused by his discomfort. Apologies, Your Highness, he replied, standing awkwardly before taking a seat across from her. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to sit or wait for her to tell him where to go, but she didn't seem interested in formalities today. You are a human. After all, she said casually, as if the words were a statement of fact. You are used to being late. We Arendorians value punctuality. Jackson gave a small chuckle, trying to ease the tension. Not all humans are late, Your Highness. But I guess when in Rome, she raised an eyebrow, cutting him off. Arendor, she corrected. Not Rome. Right, Arendor, Jackson mumbled, feeling even more out of place. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound being the occasional clink of silverware against the delicate porcelain plates. Jackson stole glances at Kira, but she was too busy eating to notice. The meal consisted of strange fruits, rich juices, and delicate pastries that were unlike anything he had tasted before. Despite himself, Jackson was impressed by the food. There was something comforting about it, as though every bite was meant to remind him that he was in the presence of something extraordinary. When the meal finally ended, Kira stood up and motioned for him to follow her. She didn't speak, but he sensed that the day's duties had already begun. The morning passed in a blur of unfamiliar customs. Kira took him to various halls of the palace, introducing him to key figures in her court, most of whom gave him cold, scrutinizing stares. But it wasn't the people who caught Jackson's attention, it was Kira herself. She moved with such grace and confidence that it almost seemed effortless. Her presence dominated the room, and everyone obeyed her with unquestioning loyalty. As the day wore on, Jackson began to realize something. This wasn't just a job for Kira. It wasn't even a power move. She was lonely. She had no real friends. All the people who surrounded her, those she called allies, advisors, even family, were nothing more than pawns in a game of politics. Jackson had seen it in her eyes when she spoke of her duties as a ruler. She was burdened with a responsibility she never asked for, and her people expected nothing less than perfection. It was in one of the palace gardens, surrounded by towering alien trees and lush, colorful flowers, that Jackson first saw a crack in her armor. Kira had been speaking with one of her council members, but when she noticed Jackson standing by, waiting for her, her usual icy expression faltered for a split second. He could have sworn he saw a flash of frustration, maybe even sadness, before it disappeared behind her mask. "Do you ever get tired of all this?" Jackson asked suddenly, surprising himself as much as her. Kira blinked, taken aback by the question. She tilted her head slightly, as though considering the sincerity of his words. "Tired?" she repeated, her voice cold but not unkind. "Of ruling? Of being the perfect princess everyone expects me to be?" Jackson nodded, sensing that he had touched on something deeper. "Yes, do you ever wish you could be someone else for a while? Someone free?" For a moment, Kira didn't answer. She looked at the vibrant garden around them, her gaze distant. Then, without looking back at him, she spoke softly. "I am Arendor. There is no one else," Jackson frowned. "But what about you? What do you want?" Her eyes flicked to him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something in her gaze. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was uncertainty. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, one of her guards approached, signaling that it was time for their next meeting. "Perhaps I'll tell you another time. Human," she said, her tone returning to its usual controlled self. But there was something different now, a subtle shift. Jackson wasn't sure what it meant, but he had a feeling that something had changed between them. As the days went by, Jackson and Kira began to spend more time together. The romantic duties she had spoken of still seemed strange and awkward, but there was something undeniable about the connection forming between them. They had long conversations about the state of the galaxy, their respective peoples, and the struggles of being in positions of power. Despite her high walls, Jackson began to see glimpses of who Kira truly was, a woman trapped by her responsibilities, bound by the expectations of her people. She had been groomed from birth to rule, but no one had ever asked her what she wanted. No one had ever considered that she might long for something more than power. It was during one such conversation that Jackson found himself offering her a piece of advice he had never thought he'd give to someone like her. "Maybe," he said, "you should just let go for once. Take a risk. Not everything has to be about control." Kira's eyes softened for a brief moment. "Control is all I have left." Jackson could see the pain behind her words, the weight of a life lived for others and not for herself. He didn't know what it meant for them or where this bond was taking them, but he knew one thing. He wasn't just a diplomat anymore. He was becoming something more to her. A confidant, perhaps even a friend. And as the days turned into weeks, Jackson couldn't help but feel that the bond between them was growing stronger. What started as a strange diplomatic duty was beginning to feel more like a mission of the heart. Whether Kira would ever admit it, Jackson knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. Jackson had started to feel like he belonged in Arendor. It wasn't just about the alien landscapes or the strange customs anymore. It was Kira. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly close to someone whose life was completely different from his own. They had shared stories, thoughts, and even some laughter, although brief. The walls between them were starting to come down, and for Jackson, it felt like a slow-burning connection that he couldn't quite ignore. But everything changed one evening. It started with a meeting that Kira had called in her private chambers. The royal guard stood like statues in the corners of the room, their faces emotionless, ever watchful. The large holographic screen flickered to life, showing the faces of several high-ranking officials from various parts of the galaxy. The discussion was about the rising political tensions in the galaxy, and as the meeting progressed, Jackson began to notice that Kira wasn't her usual composed self. Her brow furrowed, her fingers drummed against the surface of the table. Something was off. "We cannot keep ignoring this," Kira said, her voice steady but tinged with an edge of frustration. "The radical factions on Arendor are gaining ground and their influence is spreading like wildfire." Jackson, sitting quietly at the side of the room, exchanged a quick glance with the nearest royal guard. He had learned over the past few weeks that radical factions were a polite term for dangerous political groups that wanted to overthrow the established order. They didn't want a change in leadership. They wanted chaos. Kira paused, looking at each of her advisors. "This war will spill over if we don't take action now." One of the advisors, a tall alien with blue skin and sharp features, stepped forward. "Princess, we believe it's time to consider your personal involvement. The radicals see you as a symbol of the old regime. We need to distance you from the throne temporarily." Jackson felt a shiver run down his spine. The tension in the room was palpable. Kira, though outwardly calm, looked anything but. Her eyes flicked to him, as if sensing his presence, and for a moment he thought she might ask him to leave. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and spoke with quiet authority. "Your suggestion is weak. If I hide now, it will only show weakness to those who oppose me. Arendor has already seen enough weakness." She looked at Jackson as if searching for something in his expression. "They want to take everything from me, from my people. I cannot afford to give them any more reason to believe that I am not in control." Jackson felt a rush of sympathy. He had seen Kira as a ruler, a distant and calculating force, but now he saw the burden on her shoulders, the weight of the crown she carried. She wasn't just a princess. She was the lifeblood of her world, and to lose that control meant the collapse of everything she had fought for. Without thinking, Jackson stepped forward. "What if we take the fight to them? Show them we're not backing down." The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at him. Kira's gaze was piercing, studying him as if she were trying to decipher his words. For a second, Jackson regretted speaking. What did he know about galactic politics? What did he know about overthrowing radical factions? But to his surprise, Kira's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "You do not know Arendor's people as I do, human. They are not like the species you are accustomed to. They do not follow power simply because it is in front of them. But they follow you," Jackson said, his voice steady. "You're their leader, and they respect you. If you show them that you're not afraid, maybe they'll follow you back." Kira studied him for a moment longer. Then, to Jackson's surprise, she nodded slowly. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps it is time for something drastic." But even as she spoke those words, Jackson knew something darker was at play. This wasn't just about radicals anymore. This was about a larger, more dangerous force that had been lurking in the shadows, one that Kira hadn't fully trusted him with. The next day, Jackson and Kira were alone again. The palace had grown quieter in the aftermath of the meeting. The tension was building, and Jackson could feel it in his bones. They had been planning a diplomatic trip to several key allies, but the unexpected political upheaval had forced them to rethink the approach. Kira had insisted that they go forward with the trip, though, if only to maintain a semblance of control. As they sat in the royal transport, the atmosphere between them felt different. Kira seemed more withdrawn, her eyes fixed on the stars outside the window. Jackson had come to understand the small signs of stress in her posture, the way her fingers twitched when she was deep in thought. "Do you ever wonder if it's all worth it?" Jackson asked quietly, not entirely sure why he was asking the question. "Being a ruler, I mean. All this power, the responsibility." Kira didn't answer right away. She stared out at the stars, her face a mask of cold composure. But when she did speak, her voice was quieter than Jackson had ever heard it. "It is worth it for my people," she said softly. But it is never easy. Every decision I make, every word I speak has consequences. I was raised to be a leader, to never show weakness. But there are days when I wonder if it's too much. Jackson watched her carefully, trying to understand the depth of her words. They had been through so much together, and yet he was just beginning to realize how much she had been hiding behind her regal exterior. "You're not alone, Kira," he said, his voice gentle. "You don't have to carry all of this on your own. You've got people who care about you. People who trust you." Kira finally looked at him, her eyes intense. She held his gaze for a long moment before slowly breaking eye contact. "I trust you, Jackson, more than you know." The words were simple, but they held weight. Kira wasn't the type to express vulnerability, and for her to admit this to him meant something deeper than he could fully understand. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just nodded, allowing the silence to settle between them. Their journey was interrupted the next day by an urgent call. It was a message from one of Kira's most trusted commanders, warning her of a plot to assassinate her. The radical factions had gained support among some of the more influential members of the royal court. They had planned a strike during the diplomatic tour, catching Kira off guard. The message was clear. If they didn't act fast, the royal family would be at risk. The quiet tension that had been building suddenly snapped. Kira's expression hardened, and without hesitation, she ordered the ship to return to the palace. They were no longer just diplomats, they were targets. And now, the stakes were higher than ever before. Jackson's heart raced as they rushed back to the safety of the palace. He had never felt so alive, so deeply aware of the danger they were in. Kira was not just a princess anymore. She was a woman fighting for her life, her kingdom, and her people. As they prepared for the final confrontation, Jackson couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Kira survive the assassination attempt? And what did all this mean for their growing bond? He didn't know the answers. But one thing was certain, everything was about to change. Jackson could hear the distant sounds of sirens as the royal guards rushed through the halls, preparing for the worst. The message had come in the night, a threat that couldn't be ignored. There was a plot to assassinate Kira, and the radicals, those who believed her rule had gone on long enough, had finally taken action. Kira, usually composed and calculating, was now pacing in her private chambers, her brow furrowed with concentration. Her usual grace was replaced by a tense, almost frantic energy. Jackson stood at the doorway, watching her carefully, wondering if she was as frightened as she appeared. He had never seen her so vulnerable before, and it made his heart race. "You're sure they'll strike soon?" Jackson asked, his voice steady despite the nerves crawling up his spine. Kira paused, her back to him, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. She didn't turn around immediately, but when she did, her eyes were sharp, intense. "Yes, the attack is imminent. We can't wait any longer." Jackson had always known that being close to Kira would put him in dangerous situations, but this was different. This was real. It wasn't just political maneuvering anymore. It was life or death. "Then we stop it," Jackson said, stepping forward, determination setting in. He wasn't about to stand by and watch someone he had grown to respect, someone he cared about, be taken from this world because of political games. Kira gave him a long, appraising look. She opened her mouth to say something, but instead she closed it, her expression softening just slightly. "You truly want to help me?" He nodded. "I didn't come all this way just to watch. We can fight this together." For a moment there was silence between them, but Jackson could see that Kira was thinking hard. She had been alone in her royal duties for so long, forced to trust no one, but Jackson's words seemed to reach her. She knew she couldn't do this alone anymore. Perhaps for the first time she was willing to let someone in. "We'll need to move quickly," Kira finally said, her voice still cool but with a new sense of resolve. "I'll deal with the court's reaction, but you'll have to help me with the escape." Jackson's heart skipped. "Escape?" Kira nodded. "If they think they've taken me, they'll be emboldened. We'll make them think they've succeeded, but we'll be one step ahead." The plan was set in motion within minutes. Kira's trusted guards, along with a select few loyal advisors, were alerted and given their orders. Jackson, who had never imagined he'd find himself in the middle of a palace coup, felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He was no longer a diplomat sent to smile and make friends. He was now part of Kira's inner circle, tasked with protecting her at all costs. The royal transport was waiting in the shadows, hidden just outside the palace walls. It was small enough to evade radar, fast enough to outrun any potential pursuit, but getting there wouldn't be easy. The conspirators had likely already infiltrated the palace, and their eyes were everywhere. Jackson stood at Kira's side, ready to protect her. They moved through the palace hallways in the dead of night, the sounds of their footsteps muffled by the grandeur of the royal corridors. It was strange. The once vibrant palace, filled with whispers of power and luxury, now felt hollow, as though it were on the verge of collapse. When they reached the transport bay, everything went wrong. A loud crash echoed from behind them. Kira's eyes widened. "They're here." Before Jackson could react, several figures appeared in the hallway, their faces masked and their movements swift. They were heavily armed, their intentions clear. Kira's royal guards immediately sprang into action, drawing weapons and forming a protective barrier around her. "Get to the transport," one of the guards shouted, pushing Jackson toward the exit. "We'll hold them off." Kira was already moving, her feet sure and quick as she sprinted toward the waiting ship. Jackson hesitated, looking back toward the guards who were fighting to protect them. He wanted to help, but the reality of the situation hit him hard. There was no time to fight. It was a matter of escape, of survival. He rushed forward, catching up to Kira, and they both dove into the transport. The hatch closed with a heavy thud, and the ship lurched into the air, quickly ascending into the night sky. As the transport soared above the palace, Jackson glanced over at Kira. She was staring out of the window, her face unreadable. Her hands were clenched tightly, her knuckles white against the soft fabric of her cloak. The fight was far from over, but at least for the moment they were safe. Jackson sat beside her, trying to find the right words. "Are you okay?" Kira's eyes flicked to him. For the first time in what felt like ages, her guard was down, just a little. "I'm alive. That's all that matters right now." The silence between them was heavy. The tension of the escape still hung in the air, but it was accompanied by something else, something Jackson couldn't quite put his finger on. He had never felt closer to Kira, and yet, it wasn't just the danger that had brought them together. It was something deeper, something that had grown between them during the past weeks. "You know," Jackson said slowly, "you don't have to do this alone anymore. I'm here. I'll always be here." Kira's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I've known for a while now." For the first time, Jackson saw a glimpse of vulnerability in her eyes, something he hadn't expected. It was a small crack in her armor, but it was there, and it meant everything. The transport continued to climb, leaving the burning lights of the palace behind. The stars were bright, distant, and beautiful, a reminder that there was still a vast galaxy to explore, even after all the chaos. Jackson and Kira sat in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Jackson knew that there was much to do. The radicals weren't going to give up easily, and the conspiracy within the royal court had just begun. But as he looked at Kira sitting beside him, her face strong and determined, he realized something important. No matter how dangerous things became, he wasn't going anywhere. He had chosen to be a part of this, to stand by her side, not just as a diplomat but as someone who had come to care for her in ways he hadn't expected. And though their journey was far from over, Jackson knew one thing for sure: he would see it through. For her, for the galaxy, and for the future they could build together. Back at the palace, chaos reigned. The assassins had broken into the royal chambers, expecting to find Kira vulnerable, unprotected. But by the time they arrived, she was already gone, along with Jackson. The conspirators were left in the dark, unsure of what had just happened, and somewhere in the shadows, a new plan was being set in motion. One that would involve not just Kira, but humanity as well. The future of Arendor, and perhaps the entire galaxy, would depend on the choices Kira and Jackson made in the coming days. As the transport flew into the night, the first hints of dawn began to appear on the horizon. The battle was far from over, but it was only just beginning.